As you know, this show has been started to talk about people, places, and programs who are impacting the incarceration crisis, to look at people whose lives have been changed and people who are now changing lives. I just had I came across this article, actually someone sent it to me. I guess this young man was on television a few days ago talking about the fact that he'd been incarcerated for 3 years and he didn't do it. But he chose not to say and take a plea, and he ended up staying there because he couldn't get a court date. Right. So after these 3 years of being behind the walls, he comes back and he talks about how he was happy to be home, but at the same time, he felt like he was still incarcerated because there were so many triggers for him and things that caused him to feel like he was still incarcerated. Can you speak to that in terms of having an understanding of what that might be or what that might entail?
Well, for me, when I think of a scenario like that, I think a little bit about my story, and I don't know what the circumstances were around this person's initial contact with being in custody or what their life was like. I know for me that at one point incarceration was an escape for me. I felt more free in the institution than I did on the street, that I had created a prison for myself on the street. So when we spend any amount of time in an institution where our movement is regulated, our time to eat is regulated, and then entering back into the community, it can be very difficult to adjust and or readjust back to regular life on the street.
It's very interesting that you talk about eating as one of the things, because this young man said one of the very same things. He said one of the triggers for him, and it kind of struck me as an odd trigger. One of the triggers, this one was not odd, the one about the police cruisers. When they come around, he said, oh my goodness, I know I haven't done anything, but you know, it's kind of like, you know, that's that trigger for a while. Could I go back behind those walls? He said, but one of the other things that he said was food.
Okay.
He said when he had food that was similar to what he had on the inside, or something that would make him remember the meals, he said what he would think about was how he'd go for hours and hours with not eating and being hungry all the time because sometimes the food wasn't, you know, palatable.
Okay.
And so can you speak to that in terms of whether or not you had that same type of experience when returning home?
Well, I know that the food in the county jail is much different than the food in state prisons. The quality of food in state prisons is a little better. But when you come home, there's certain things that you just refuse to eat, because on the commissary, some of the things that you buy on commissary that you buy on a monthly basis are like cup of noodles or top ramen noodles, and when you come home you say, I don't want to even look at a top ramen noodle. Or oatmeal. You get oatmeal maybe 3 or 4 times a week, and when breakfast is served sometimes at 4 o'clock in the morning, and then you get a box lunch that you get a chance to eat sometime throughout that day, and then dinner is not until like maybe 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. You think about those things when you get on the street. I would think that it gives you more of an appreciation for the freedoms that you have and the choices that you have when you are on the streets, if you are living a life that allows you to have choice.
Very interesting the way you put that. One of the other things, before we move on to talk more about you, I want to relate back to this article, was the young man said that his friends, when he came back outside, though he was happy to be free, they said they kept saying to him, come out of that jail shell, come out of that jail shell, man, you home now. And what he said was he realized that he really wasn't in a jail shell, that he acclimated to some of these types of behaviors, and that had become his norm. And it was a way of keeping himself safe. He said he'd become more withdrawn, he'd become more quiet and wanted to stay by himself, as opposed to that he thought he was going to seek, you know, having that camaraderie and being able to talk to people who loved and cared about him. So he's found that the jail shell had become a part of who he was, and becoming more of a person looking over their back and being concerned. Now, can you speak to that in terms of your experience or experiences of others that you may be aware of?
Well, I think people in general who have had experiences with traumas, incarceration is traumatic. Certain experiences on the street are traumatic. Things that we experience growing up, in the various degrees of traumatic experiences that we maneuver through, we develop coping skills and protection mechanisms. And so behind the bars, in the institution, it's a way of life. It's another world in the institution. Your awareness is heightened. Your flight or fight type of mechanism is aroused, and whether you like it or not. And so when you come home, because even if he wasn't on parole, because our freedom becomes more valuable to us, and we start to really evaluate the people that we are around, and realizing that someone else's actions could cause us very easily to become incarcerated again. We do withdraw. And not necessarily in a negative aspect. We withdraw because when we're incarcerated, we get those moments of clarity where we start to question, where is my life at today? Where's my life going when I'm released from here?
Let's segue into your background in terms of, tell us a little bit about your life story and you know, how did you come to where you came to, and then we're going to cross over into where you are now.
Okay. All right. Well, I came here to California in 1982, and I'm the youngest of 6 children, and I was born and raised in Boston. Okay. And it was difficult for me. I was raised in an all-black neighborhood by an African-American mother, and my light, bright skin caused a lot of problems for me in a very racial and then segregated school system coming up. I can remember dropping out of school in the 8th grade as a result of not wanting to deal with the integration of African Americans and Caucasians in various schools and in various neighborhoods and communities. I can remember the buses being stoned and so forth, and it was frightening excuse me, to get an education at one point in my life. And you know, the type of role models that I aspired to, they weren't in school. They were on the street corner. They were making money. They were not allowing the system that said that you can't have, keep them from having. And so I aspired to that.
And this was what, 25 years ago, perhaps? I'm asking it. So what I'm hearing from you is the story is still the same today. You know, in terms of the types of triggers, if you will, that are out there, the types of lures for our youth are similar to some of the things that I'm hearing you say. So continue on with the story, please.
So you know, I had some traumatic experiences growing up. Was molested as a child, and I didn't tell anyone. And the experiences of coping with that type of trauma, as I mentioned earlier, we learn to cope. We learn to start in using some of that trauma to our advantage. I learned manipulation very early on, and I found that I could manipulate my way through things. You know, the older gentleman may be playing checkers at the corner store, you know, who would sneak a feel on a minor. Well, my awareness was heightened in that aspect. And so, because I was being sexually molested, so I could say, you want to touch me, give me some money. Let me buy my friends and I some penny candy, type of thing. And that behavior, it's progressive, just as any other behavior. That behavior is progressive. So when I came to California, in fact, the night that I got off the bus on 1st and Mission Street in San Francisco, the 49ers had won the Super Bowl. And so the city was in an uproar, and here I was, 14 years old, and very impressionable. I was looking for acceptance. I was looking to be a part of. And at that time, for me, anything that was appealing for me at that time is what I got involved in.
What do you think could have changed the path for you?
I think had I gotten involved in possibly going back to school, if getting an education was a priority, if I had someone that said, you need to get back into school. My mother was going through some difficult times, and I know today that she did the best that she could. But I also, I had this idea that, that after, being the youngest of 6 children, that I would come to California where my mother was living, and that her and I would, develop this mother-daughter relationship that I didn't get a chance to have growing up, and that, I would get this mothering that I didn't feel that I had gotten earlier, and that didn't happen. I think that my mother was at a time in her life where being a parent wasn't something that she was trying to find her life and trying to find herself, and it didn't fit in that picture. And although she didn't abandon me, she just wasn't emotionally available, I should say. And so what I think would have been different for me is that if I had something different to aspire to. I met that man that had that suit on, that had that fancy car, that had that money, that was able to buy whatever he wanted, and that was attractive to me. Selling drugs.
And was there.
It was there. It was there, and I really believe that I had been looking for that father figure most of my life. I have older brothers who, in their own right, try to be that positive father figure for me. And I think that my stepfather robbed me of that. Because one of the things that I did learn further on down the road is that I learned to bond with my perpetrators. My stepfather, although he had been molesting me at night, and the nighttime became my nightmare. In the daytime, he was still that person that tied my shoe. He was still that person that held my hand across the street, and so I had to accept that, maybe this was the way it was. Maybe this is how fathers, showed their daughters, affection and love. And so I looked for that, and it wasn't long before I started using cocaine.
Okay. Let's segue now to how you were behind the walls. How much time did you spend on the other side, if you will, and what that experience may have been like?
Well, again, when I can say that by the time I was 16, between 16 and 18 years old, I was freebasing cocaine. And I was in an arena where it was readily available for me. I, had been in the company of some folks that, had large quantities and so forth. So the getting and the using and the finding ways, I didn't have to do much to get more. And by the time I was 18 years old, I was addicted to cocaine, and I gave birth to my first daughter. I went into labor while using cocaine, and it wasn't long after I gave birth to her that I found myself incarcerated for possession for sales, and drug sales, and Then I gave birth to a handicapped daughter. Thereafter, another 2 years after that, continuing to use. I tried to get clean a couple of times, but I wasn't willing, I wasn't ready. You know, I was still going through the low self-esteem, the low self-worth, blaming myself for the things that had happened to me, you know, in that victim role, you know.
What do you think was, you know, as you're saying these things and blaming myself, and, you know, I'm looking at all of the circle and the cycle, if you will. What, if you could put your finger on a turning point, and I don't know if you can encapsulate it in just one thing, or was it a series of things, where did we now begin to get to the Nicole that sits before me today? What was that turning point?
In 1993, I gave birth to my third child in Chowchilla State Prison. And I can remember giving birth to my son in Madera County Hospital at 2-something in the afternoon, and being back in the institution for count time by 11 o'clock. And that feeling that you get when you've just given birth to another human being, and you're shackled back down, and you're brought back to an institution, and you know, I didn't want to live like that anymore. And I can remember going to my counselor saying that I did not want to leave the institution without knowing that I would go into treatment after getting released. And because I had, you know, the downward spiral, the cycle that I had been on, I'd go to jail, you know, I'd stay in jail for a while, and then I'd get out, and again, I was freer in prison than I was on the streets. I would get stuck in a 4-block radius, you know, 15th and Mission to 18th and Mission. I could not come up out of that comfort zone. You know, and as I've said before, that handcuffs always had to be my divine intervention, because I did not know how to do for myself what someone else could help me do.
Wow, what a powerful statement. But we know today that you have moved on with your life, and I'd like you to share with our viewers some of that journey. Ms. Nicole Petway is now a certified addictions treatment coordinator. Did I say that right?
Counselor.
Counselor, okay. So if you'll share with our viewers how you came from that story, from Boston to San Francisco, to the drugs and in and out, to the bearing of your children, and to that changing, that moment of change with your third child at Chowchilla. How did Nicole make it to here and your life after incarceration?
Well, I think the turning point for me was giving birth to my third child in state prison. That whole experience of giving birth and being back in the institution for Countdown later on that evening was very, that in itself was traumatic. And I didn't want to live like that anymore. It was my third child, and I hadn't been taking care of my first 2 children, and I did not want to bring another child into this world without being a responsible, productive parent, let alone member of society. And I asked to be placed into treatment, into a treatment facility from release of prison. You know, and like I say, institution for me was my divine intervention, you know, being able to have a moment of clarity. The program that I went into at the time was a homeless shelter for people on parole. And just utilizing the services from this particular program, and getting my high school diploma, and just various certifications, going back into my communities and giving back. You know, I dropped out of school in the 8th grade, so I did not feel that I had anything to offer. And so when I started to build my self-esteem, and I started to realize where I do come from, and started to appreciate that, if I can make it out in the streets, And you know, getting loaded is a hard job. Well, they say one addict helping another is without parallel. And one addict can best understand and help another addict. And when you are able to be employed in a field where assisting folks getting out of the institution, you know, for me, the gift of desperation was one of the major things that motivated me. You know, they say pain, you know, and desperation, it'll either move you forward or it'll continue moving you backwards.
That's it.
And for me, it moved me forward.
Excellent.
And so I try to promote that to others and help them remove the barriers that it takes to succeed. And there is life after incarceration. You know, that old saying of once a pickle, no longer a cucumber. It's not true when it comes to someone getting out and being able to rehabilitate, and then also not just rehabilitate, but able to give back to their communities as well. It's possible.
And we need to hear more of these stories of positivity. We need to hear more of these stories of triumph, more of these stories of people who are doing great things with their life, but also helping others to do great things with their life. Find a way to get involved in the crisis. Find a way to shift the paradigm. Find a way to lend your hand to the plow, if you will. It's important for us to recognize that people who want to move on with their lives deserve a second chance.